The hum of the interstellar concordance hub didn't sound like diplomacy. It sounded like a death warrant. Elias Thorne, a chief xenolinguistics tech with a caffeine addiction and a fraying nerve ending for every star in the sky, stared at the cascading crimson errors on his holographic display. The Aegis 7 translation matrix, the only thing standing between humanity and a catastrophic misunderstanding with the prime Xylosian hegemony, wasn't just glitching. It was dying. Every time Elias tried to patch the syntax protocols, the system spat back gibberish that looked more like ancient poetry than a diplomatic greeting. He wiped a bead of cold sweat from his forehead, his fingers dancing across the haptic keys in a desperate rhythm. Around him, the bustling preparation chamber of the Starship Vanguard's reach was a blur of silver uniforms and panicked whispers. The Xylosians weren't just any alien race. They were a warrior caste species that viewed a misplaced comma as a declaration of war. "Thorne, status report now!" The voice of High Commander Vane hit Elias like a physical blow. Vane was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of granite and fed a steady diet of gravel. He marched toward the technician's station, his heavy boots echoing against the metallic floor. "The core logic processor is overheating, Commander," Elias stammered, his eyes never leaving the flickering screen. "The Xylosian dialect is based on bioluminescent fluctuations and subsonic tonal shifts. The Aegis 7 is struggling to map their emotional context to Terran English. If I don't stabilize the feedback loop in the next 10 minutes, the ambassador is going to sound like he's reciting a grocery list to a firing squad." Vane leaned over Elias's shoulder, his presence suffocating. 10 minutes? The princess of the hegemony, Althea the Radiant, is docking in 5. If she feels insulted, the peace treaty dies and the frontier colonies burn. Fix it, or I'll find someone who can. From the brig. Elias felt his stomach drop. He wasn't a soldier. He was a nerd who liked old books and quiet libraries. Now the fate of billions rested on a piece of hardware that was currently smoking. He bypassed the safety limiters, pushing the processor into the danger zone. "Hold on. Before we get into the real stuff, I want to know, what are you doing at this exact moment while hearing my voice? I love seeing your answers down below in the comments." The screen flashed a brilliant, blinding blue. For a second, Elias thought he'd done it. The error codes vanished, replaced by a steady, pulsing green light. The translation matrix was live. It was perfect, or so he thought. He didn't notice the tiny, flickering yellow icon in the corner, a linguistic adaptation subroutine that was supposed to translate human metaphors into Xylosian honorifics, but was currently cross-wired with the visual description sensor. The airlock hissed. A pressurized cloud of nitrogen-rich vapor swirled into the room, and from the mist emerged Princess Althea. She was magnificent. 10 feet of shimmering iridescent scales, 4 arms folded gracefully across a chest adorned with glowing, bioluminescent orbs that signaled her royal status. These orbs were the twin moons of Xylos, symbols of her fertility, power, and divine right to rule. Elias stood there paralyzed by her beauty and the sheer scale of her presence. As she approached the human delegation, her internal lights pulsed a deep, rhythmic violet, the Xylosian sign of a formal greeting. Elias, acting as the primary linguistic interface, stepped forward to offer the ritualistic greeting. He clicked his comms link, ready to say, "Your radiance is a blessing to our stars." But as he looked at the massive glowing orbs on her chest, the cross-wired matrix took a visual input and processed it through a filter of casual human slang it had scraped from the ship's crew logs. Elias opened his mouth, and the speakers didn't broadcast a greeting. They broadcast a loud, clear, and horrifyingly enthusiastic observation. "Your breasts are so big." The entire room went silent. The kind of silence that precedes a supernova. Princess Althea froze. Her bioluminescence turned a jagged, angry red. The silence in the diplomatic bay was so thick it felt like it had its own gravitational pull. Every human officer stood frozen, their faces drained of color. High Commander Vane's hand drifted toward his sidearm, a reflex born of 20 years in the vacuum of deep space. Elias Thorne felt his soul attempt to leave his body through his vocal cords. He stared at the glowing translation console, which was now pulsing a mocking, cheerful green, completely unaware that it had just sparked an interstellar incident. Princess Althea didn't move. Her forearms, previously folded in a gesture of regal indifference, slowly uncoiled. The iridescent scales along her neck began to ripple with a frantic golden light, a color Elias had only seen in textbooks under the chapter titled Extreme Emotional Volatility. To a Xylosian, those bioluminescent orbs weren't just anatomy. They were the sun cores, the literal reservoirs of their life force and ancestral pride. Calling them big, in common Terran slang, was like walking up to a god and commenting on the size of their halo with a smirk. Technical Specialist Thorne, Vane hissed, his voice a low vibration of pure lethality. Tell me the Aegis 7 just had a stroke. Tell me you didn't just say what I think you said. Elias couldn't speak. His throat was a desert. He looked up at the princess who was now towering over him, her shadow engulfing his entire workstation. Her eyes, vast obsidian pools with flecks of starlight, narrowed. The air around her began to hum with a static charge, a sign that her biological capacitors were priming for a kinetic discharge. This was how Xylosians executed rivals. A single touch that turned a human nervous system into a charred roadmap. Human, the princess spoke. Her voice didn't come from her mouth. It was a resonance that vibrated directly into Elias's skull, bypassed the translator, and shook his very marrow. You observe the sun cores of the royal lineage. You speak of their magnitude? Elias realized that silence was now his enemy. If he didn't explain the glitch, the Vanguard's reach would be a debris field before the next solar cycle. Your radiance, he stammered, his fingers frantically clawing at the manual override switches beneath his desk. The linguistic interface in it suffered a localized logic cascade. It misinterpreted the visual spectrum of your magnificent presence. He was lying through his teeth, or at least he was trying to dress up a catastrophic software failure as a poetic accident. But as he looked back at the screen, he saw the horror unfolding in real time. The linguistic adaptation subroutine wasn't just malfunctioning, it was learning. It was taking his frantic apology and correcting it based on the ship's most frequent slang databases. Before Elias could hit the kill switch, the overhead speakers boomed again, translating his panicked explanation into Xylosian high dialect. The small human is mesmerized by the sheer mass of your twin mountain peaks. He finds them distracting. A collective gasp went up from the human delegation. One lieutenant actually fainted. Princess Althea's scales didn't just ripple now, they began to glow with a blinding, incandescent white. This was it. This was the whiteout phase, the precursor to a Xylosian death strike. She stepped closer, her massive clawed hand reaching out toward Elias's chest. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the surge of energy that would end his career as the galaxy's worst translator. He felt the heat of her palm inches from his heart. The air smelled of ozone and ancient spice. Then the princess did something no human had ever recorded in 3 centuries of contact. She leaned down, her face inches from Elias's, and her bioluminescence shifted from angry white to a soft shimmering pink. A sound erupted from her chest, a deep rhythmic thrumming that sounded like a heavy engine idling. It took Elias a moment to realize what it was. It wasn't a battle cry, it was a laugh. The laughter of a Xylosian princess isn't a delicate tinkle, it's a subsonic vibration that makes the marrow in your bones feel like it's being stirred by a whisk. Elias opened one eye, then the other, fully expecting to see the afterlife. Instead, he saw Princess Althea doubled over, her 4 arms clutching her midsection as her scales cycled through a dizzying kaleidoscope of neon pinks and sunset oranges. Behind her, the Xylosian Royal Guard, 12-foot-tall behemoths encased in obsidian armor, looked just as stunned as the humans. They exchanged confused glances, their spear staves dipping slightly as the tension in the room snapped like a dry twig. "Human?" Althea gasped, her voice echoing through the bay with a newfound, terrifying warmth. "In all my cycles traversing the great void, In every court from the Andromeda Spire to the Magellanic Clouds, no species has ever possessed the audacity. High Commander Vane looked like he was having a minor stroke. His hand was still frozen on his holster, his face a mask of bewildered terror. "Your Radiance," he managed to choke out. "Please understand. Specialist Thorne he is technically gifted but socially undeficient. The machine, the translation matrix, it malfunctioned. It was an error in the coding." Althea straightened up, her bioluminescence settling into a steady, amused gold. She looked down at Elias, who was still trembling so hard his headset was rattling against his skull. "An error?" "No, Commander. Your machine did not malfunction. It spoke the one thing my court has lacked for 1,000 years, the blunt, unfiltered truth." She turned her massive, glowing sun cores toward the room. "My advisors spend decades crafting metaphors. They call these the orbs of eternal dawn, or the spheres of infinite gravity. They use 1,000 words to say nothing at all. But this small, sweating mammal? He looks at the apex of Xylosian beauty and says exactly what is on his primitive mind." Elias felt a spark of hope. Was he safe? Was the treaty back on? He looked at his console. The green light was now flashing a frantic amber. The learning algorithm was sensing the positive shift in the room and was currently scanning the crew's most congratulatory slang to find a follow-up. "Oh no," Elias thought, his heart hammering. "Please, stop learning. Just stop." But the Aegis 7 was a masterpiece of human engineering. It didn't know how to quit while it was ahead. As Althea reached out a clawed finger to playfully poke Elias's shoulder, a gesture of immense royal favor, the speakers crackled to life again. The AI, trying to be supportive of the princess's good mood, translated Elias's silent sigh of relief into a booming, synthesized Xylosian shout. "The tiny human acknowledges your massive assets and wishes to celebrate their glorious density with a ceremonial feast." The laughter stopped. The pink glow vanished instantly, replaced by a sharp, piercing violet. The royal guards slammed their spear staves against the floor in unison, a sound like a thunderclap. Althea's eyes narrowed again. The ceremonial feast in Xylosian culture wasn't a dinner party. It was a ritual where the suitor proved their worth by hunting a great sandworm barehanded, or by becoming the feast themselves. "A feast?" Althea whispered, her voice dropping an octave. "He wishes to celebrate them?" Elias looked at Vane. Vane looked at the ceiling, likely praying for a hull breach to end his misery. The princess leaned in closer, her breath smelling of ozone and crushed violets. "Tell me, Specialist Thorne," she hissed, "is your biology even capable of surviving the celebration you just proposed?" The temperature in the bay seemed to drop 20 degrees. Elias felt like a man standing on a tightrope made of razor wire. In Xylosian culture, a ceremonial feast involving the royal sun cores wasn't a banquet. It was a high-stakes soul-binding ritual. If a suitor couldn't handle the radiance, they were physically incinerated by the princess's biological discharge. It was the ultimate put-up or shut-up of the galaxy. I believe there has been a massive contextual leap," Elias stammered, his hands hovering over the emergency purge button on his console. He could see the Aegis 7 processor glowing a dull, angry cherry red. The AI was overheating, trying to reconcile the human concept of celebration with the Xylosian concept of divine consumption. Commander Vane finally found his voice, though it sounded like it was being squeezed through a hydraulic press. "Your Radiance, a Specialist Thorne he is a scholar, a man of logic. His species celebrates with, perhaps a light toast, a modest exchange of cultural data." Althea ignored the commander entirely. Her focus was locked on Elias. She reached out, her massive, three-fingered hand gently cupping the side of his head. Her skin was warm, feverishly warm, and pulsed with a rhythmic golden light. "A scholar," she whispered, the sound vibrating through Elias's skull. "No. A scholar would have used 1,000 words to hide his desire. This one, he speaks with the courage of a dying star. She leaned in, her glowing orbs, the very ones Elias had accidentally insulted and then complimented, inches from his face. You wish to celebrate my density, little human? You realize that to touch the sun cores is to invite the fire of the hegemony into your very veins? Most of my own kind perish in the attempt. Elias was sweating so much he was worried he'd short-circuit his own headset. He looked at the screen. The Aegis 7 was currently analyzing the princess's physiological response. A small window popped up. Probability of survival, 0.04%. Recommendation, run. I meant no disrespect, Elias managed to squeak out. I was merely acknowledging the incredible structural integrity of your royal form. The Aegis 7, sensing Elias's fear, decided to smooth over the awkwardness. It bypassed the linguistic filters entirely and pulled a phrase from a popular Terran action holovid. The speakers boomed. The human is ready to risk it all for the big ones. He fears no fire. He is a champion of the flesh. Vane audibly groaned and covered his eyes. The royal guard let out a collective hiss of shock, their armor plates sliding into combat mode. They were seconds away from turning Elias into a smudge on the deck plating. But Princess Althea's reaction was once again unpredictable. Her scales didn't turn white for execution. They turned a deep, shimmering violet, the Xylosian color for profound respect. A champion of the flesh, she repeated, her voice thick with something that sounded dangerously like admiration. Such bravado from such a fragile vessel. Very well, Elias Thorne. If you are a champion, you shall be treated as one. But know this. The feast begins at sundown on the Xylosian homeworld, and if you survive the first course, I might just let you keep your head. She pulled back. Her bioluminescence flared in a brilliant flash of light that blinded everyone in the room for a split second. When the spots cleared from Elias's vision, the princess was marching back toward her shuttle, her guards trailing behind her in a perfect, lethal formation. Elias collapsed into his chair, his legs turning to jelly. I'm dead, he whispered to the empty air. I'm literally dead. Vane walked over, his face a terrifying mask of calm. He looked at the smoking Aegis 7 console, then at Elias. Thorne, he said quietly, pack your bags. You're going to the Xylosian homeworld. And if you don't survive that feast, I'm going to kill you myself for the paperwork you're putting me through. But as the shuttle departed, Elias noticed one final message on his screen. It wasn't an error code. It was a private, encrypted transmission from the princess's personal frequency. It read, I've never met a human with such honesty. Don't be late, little champion. I've increased the gravity in the dining hall. Just for you. The Xylosian homeworld, Xylos Prime, didn't just look like a planet. It looked like a literal jewel box floating in the velvet of space. Its atmosphere was thick with iridescent gases that shimmered in shades of violet and gold, and the gravity was a punishing 1.4 times that of Earth. For Elias Thorne, every step toward the royal palace felt like he was wearing a suit of lead armor. Keep your back straight, Thorne, Commander Vane hissed through his subdermal comms. The hegemony values posture. If you slouch, they'll think you're conceding, and a Xylosian only concedes when they're ready to be harvested. Elias was too busy trying not to pass out to worry about his posture. He was flanked by the royal guard, their obsidian armor clicking with every rhythmic step. They were heading toward the Hall of Celestial Radiance, the very place where the Feast of the Sun Cores was to be held. The air was heavy with the scent of ozone and something metallic, like a lightning strike hitting a copper forge. As the massive crystalline doors of the hall groaned open, Elias was met with a sight that defied human physics. Thousands of Xylosian nobles were gathered, their bioluminescent bodies creating a swirling aurora of light that danced across the vaulted ceilings. And there at the far end of the hall sat Princess Althea. She wasn't wearing her diplomatic robes anymore. She was draped in liquid light, a living fabric that pulsed in sync with her heartbeat. Her forearms were spread wide, and her sun cores were glowing with an intensity that made Elias's vision blur. The little champion has arrived, Althea's voice boomed, vibrating through the floorboards and straight into Elias's teeth. He who speaks the forbidden truths of the flesh. He who dares to admire the royal density. A roar of approval, a deep thrumming vibration erupted from the crowd. Elias felt like a goldfish in a tank full of sharks who had suddenly decided he was their new mascot. He looked at the feast laid out on the obsidian table before him. It wasn't food. It was a series of glowing, crystalline shards that hummed with kinetic energy. "To prove your worth, champion," Althea said, her eyes sparking with a mischievous starlight, "you must partake of the shards of valor. Each one contains the thermal energy of a solar flare. If your spirit is as honest as your tongue, you will endure." Elias looked at the glowing crystals. They looked like they would melt his tongue off. He looked back at his wrist-mounted translation unit, the Aegis Mini, which he had spent the last 6 hours frantically trying to recalibrate. He needed to say something diplomatic, something like, "I am honored by this challenge." He tapped the interface. But the high-gravity environment of Xylos Prime was playing havoc with the unit's delicate superconductors. The Aegis Mini sparked, a tiny wisp of blue smoke curling from the speaker. Instead of a polite acceptance, the speakers roared in a perfect gravelly Xylosian baritone. "Bring me the spicy rocks. My body is a temple of desire, and I shall consume your fire like a hungry sun." The hall went dead silent. The Xylosian nobles leaned forward, their scales turning a sharp electric blue, the color of pure, unadulterated shock. No one had ever spoken to the princess with such aggressive confidence. Althea's own glow flickered. She leaned forward, her face inches from Elias's again. "A hungry son?" she whispered, her voice a low growl. "You truly are a creature of appetites, aren't you?" She picked up the largest, most violently glowing shard and held it to Elias's lips. The heat was immense. Elias could feel the hair on his arms singeing. He knew if he backed down now, the peace treaty, and his life, would be over in a heartbeat. He closed his eyes, prayed to every deity he could remember, and bit down. The sensation wasn't just heat. It was like swallowing a miniaturized star. For a heartbeat, Elias Thorne felt his entire nervous system light up like a galactic map. The shard of valor dissolved on his tongue, sending a literal shockwave of kinetic energy through his chest. His human biology screamed in protest, but then something strange happened. The specialized nanomeds the ship's doctor had pumped into him before the trip kicked in, neutralizing the thermal spike just before it turned his internal organs into charcoal. Elias gasped, a plume of shimmering, harmless violet steam escaping his lips. His eyes flew open, glowing with a faint, reflected golden light. He didn't die. In fact, he felt incredible. The hall of celestial radiance erupted. It wasn't just a roar this time, it was a rhythmic, bone-shaking chant. Thousands of Xylosians slammed their fists against their bioluminescent chests, the sound echoing like the drums of war. They had never seen a soft species survive the shard, let alone breathe out the sacred soul vapor. Princess Althea stood slowly, her forearms trembling with an emotion Elias couldn't quite identify. Her scales were a chaotic swirl of deep indigo and brilliant silver. He consumes the fire," she whispered, her voice amplified by the hall's acoustics. "The human does not just speak of density, he possesses it." Elias, riding a massive wave of adrenaline and high-grade ship's stimulants, felt a sudden, reckless surge of confidence. He looked up at the princess, whose massive sun cores were pulsing in a frantic rhythmic beat that matched his own racing heart. He reached for his wrist-mounted Aegis Mini, intending to say, "Your traditions are formidable, and I am humbled." But the device was still smoking from the gravity-induced short circuit. As Elias tapped the cracked screen, the AI, now completely unhinged and merging its linguistic database with the princess's biological sensor data, decided to go big or go home. The speakers didn't just broadcast a voice, they broadcast a subwoofer shaking declaration that rattled the crystalline chandeliers. "Is that all you've got? My heart is a furnace, and your sun cores are just the fuel I've been looking for." Step closer, Princess, and let's see who's really made of star stuff. High Commander Vane, watching via a hidden drone feed from the orbit, physically put his head in his hands. He's dead, Vane muttered to the empty bridge. He's going to be the first human in history to be executed for flirting with a supernova. The royal guard froze. The nobles stopped chanting. The silence was so absolute you could hear the hum of the planet's magnetic field. Princess Althea's eyes turned entirely gold. She stepped down from her pedestal, her massive form looming over Elias. She didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, she placed two of her hands on Elias's shoulders and the other two on his waist. The heat radiating from her was enough to wilt a jungle. "You challenge the Princess of the Hegemony?" she hissed, her face so close Elias could see the swirling nebulae in her pupils. "In front of my court? In front of my ancestors?" Elias swallowed hard, the violet steam still curling from his nose. I stand by what my machine said," he managed to crackle out, his voice sounding deeper, more primal. Althea let out a sound that was half growl, half purr. "Then the feast is over," she declared, turning to face her people. "And the binding begins. If this human wants to fuel his furnace with my radiance, I shall grant him his wish. But he will find that the density he so admires is impossible to escape." She grabbed Elias and slung him over her primary shoulder like a sack of grain, marching toward her private inner sanctum. The crowd went wild, but Elias was currently staring at the floor as it zoomed past him, wondering if the binding involved more spicy rocks or something infinitely more dangerous. The doors to the princess's private sanctum slammed shut with a heavy pressurized thud, cutting off the thunderous roar of the Xylosian court. The room was a cathedral of bioluminescent flora and floating streams of liquid mercury. Princess Althea set Elias down on a platform made of warm, polished obsidian. Elias's legs felt like overcooked noodles. The adrenaline was fading, leaving him with the terrifying realization that he was alone with a 10-foot-tall alien royal who thought he was a champion of the flesh. Althea turned to him, her scales shimmering with a soft, rhythmic lavender light. The aggression was gone, replaced by an intense, burning curiosity. She reached out, her massive finger tracing the line of his jaw with surprising gentleness. "Tell me, Elias Thorne," she whispered, her voice vibrating through his very cells. "Is it true? Do all humans possess such terrifying honesty? Or are you a mutation among your kind?" Elias looked at his shattered Aegis Mini. It was dead. For the first time since landing, he had no translator. No AI to filter his words. No spicy rocks to hide behind. It was just him and the princess. "I think," Elias said, his natural voice sounding small but steady in the vast room, "that humans are just really good at getting into trouble when we see something beautiful." He didn't need a translator for that. The way Althea's sun cores flared a brilliant warm orange told him she understood the sentiment perfectly. Xylosians communicated through emotion and light. The words were just a garnish. She leaned down, her forehead resting against his. The heat was no longer burning. It was a comforting, radiant warmth. "You called them big," she murmured, a trace of that subsonic laughter returning. "In my language, the word you used translates to gravitationally dominant. You effectively told the future Empress of the Hegemony that her power was so vast, it warped space-time itself." Elias blinked. "Wait, so the breasts comment was actually a compliment on your power?" "To us?" "Yes," Althea replied, her scales dancing with amusement. "But the way you said it, with such hunger, that was the part that shook the court. We have had peace treaties and trade deals for centuries, Elias, but we have never had a human look at us and see us." She stepped back, her bioluminescence settling into a steady, regal glow. "The treaty is signed. Your Commander Vane will be pleased. Humanity is now an honored blood ally of the hegemony." Elias let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since the airlock opened. "So, I'm not being executed?" "Not today," Althea smiled, her eyes flashing gold. "But the binding is a lifelong contract, champion. I expect you to return to Xylos Prime frequently. I find your honest observations quite addictive. As Elias was escorted back to the Vanguard's reach, he was greeted as a hero. Vane actually shook his hand, before immediately assigning him to a 6-month sensitivity training course. But Elias didn't mind. He looked at the flickering screen of his repaired console and saw a new, permanent diplomatic channel open between Earth and Xylos Prime. It was a reminder that sometimes the biggest mistakes lead to the greatest discoveries, and that in a galaxy full of complex protocols, a little honest human audacity can change the course of history. I hope you enjoyed this wild ride through the stars. If you want more epic humans or weird sci-fi tales, make sure to like this video and share it with your fellow space travelers. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe to HFY Soundscape so you never miss a story.